My golden brother hired a private investigator to expose my secret bankrupt life, but instead, he uncovered my hidden eight-figure tech empire and crumbled in absolute jealousy. I am 36 years old, and right now I am sitting behind the wheel of a 15-year-old Saturn. The heater barely works, the dashboard squeaks every time I hit a pothole, and the paint is peeling off the hood like a bad sunburn. If you looked at me sitting in traffic, you would probably think, there goes a guy who is barely scraping by. A guy one missed paycheck away from total ruin. And honestly, for a very long time, my own family bet their lives on that exact assumption. I grew up in a dying Rust Belt town where the skies were perpetually gray and the factories had closed down long before I was even born. My parents, Winston and Beatrice, were the kind of people who believed that your worth as a human being was directly tied to how much physical sweat you could produce in an 8-hour shift. To them, intelligence was suspicious and sensitivity was a disease. I was the middle child. I was also the outcast. While other kids were outside tackling each other in the mud and breaking bones to earn their father's approval, I was the quiet, skinny kid sitting in the corner with a book. I wasn't built for roughhousing, mostly because I was born with severe asthma. My lungs simply refused to cooperate. But in Winston's house, asthma was not a medical condition. It was a character flaw. It was an inconvenience. I still remember a specific freezing Sunday in December. I must have been around 9 years old. My parents were hosting a massive holiday dinner for the extended family. The house was packed, loud, and suffocating. I was in the living room when the attack hit me. It felt like someone had wrapped a tight leather belt around my chest and was slowly pulling it shut. I started wheezing, gasping for air, clutching my throat. My face turned a terrifying shade of pale blue. My father, Winston, walked into the room carrying a tray of beers. He stopped, looked at me struggling to stay conscious on the carpet, and sighed. A heavy, deeply annoyed sigh. He didn't drop the tray. He didn't rush over to help me. He just looked down at me and muttered that I was always trying to ruin a good time, always looking for attention. My mother, Beatrice, finally hurried over with my inhaler, but she was whispering fiercely under her breath, telling me to stop crying and go upstairs so the guests wouldn't feel uncomfortable. That was the defining moment of my childhood. That was the exact second I realized a fundamental truth about my family. My pain was an embarrassment to them. I was not a son to be nurtured. I was a defective product they had to tolerate. They didn't want to fix me, they just wanted me out of the way. And so, I learned to shrink. I learned to make myself invisible. But being invisible has its perks. When nobody is looking at you, nobody knows what you are building in the dark. If I was the defective product, my older brother, Donovan, was the golden child. Donovan is 42 now, but in his mind, he is still the high school quarterback throwing the game-winning touchdown. Donovan was everything my parents wanted. He was loud, aggressive, athletic, and possessed a deeply unearned sense of confidence. My parents worshipped the ground he walked on. It didn't matter that Donovan was actually quite awful to people behind closed doors. It didn't matter that he bullied kids at school, or that he routinely mocked me for breathing too loudly. He brought home trophies, and in a town that had nothing else to celebrate, those plastic gold cups made him a king. School was a nightmare for me. The constant anxiety and the toxic environment at home left me drained. I graduated high school with a miserable 2.5 grade point average. Donovan, meanwhile, barely passed his classes, but nobody cared because he was charming. I remember a Thanksgiving dinner from 15 years ago. It perfectly encapsulates our dynamic. Donovan had just gotten his first real job out of college working as a car salesman at a local dealership. He wasn't exactly saving lives, but he wore a cheap suit and talked a big game. During dessert, my father proudly stood up and handed Donovan a thick envelope. It was a $5,000 check for a down payment on a new car. A reward, my father said, for being a real man and joining the workforce. I was sitting at the end of the table, quietly reading a massive, heavy textbook on computer programming that I had bought secondhand. Donovan pointed at me across the table, laughed his booming, arrogant laugh, and asked if I was trying to learn how to speak to aliens because I clearly couldn't speak to human beings. My parents burst into laughter. They laughed so hard my mother spilled her wine. That was Donovan's favorite game. He elevated himself by stepping on my neck, and my parents laid down the red carpet for him to do it. As we got older, Donovan married Bianca. Bianca is the kind of woman who treats her life like a magazine cover. She is obsessed with appearances, designer bags, and showing off on social media. They were the perfect match. Two empty vessels making a lot of noise. Donovan would brag about his new powerboat, his all-terrain vehicles, and his giant house, constantly offering me unsolicited, condescending advice on how to stop being such a loser. He treated me like a pathetic charity project that he was too good for, but kept around just to make himself look better by comparison. After high school, I tried the college route. I saved up some cash from doing odd tech jobs for neighbors and enrolled in a local state college. But my heart wasn't in it. The traditional classroom environment felt like a prison, and the toxic shadow of my family followed me everywhere. I was deeply depressed. So, halfway through my second year, at the age of 20, I dropped out. The fallout was catastrophic. Winston lost his mind. We had an argument that shook the foundation of the house. He called me a failure, a parasite, a waste of his hard-earned food and shelter. He told me I would end up homeless in a ditch, and he wouldn't spare a dime to bury me. Beatrice just stood in the doorway, crying tears of embarrassment because of what the neighbors might think. I didn't yell back. I just went in my room, packed 2 duffel bags with everything I owned, threw them into the trunk of a beat-up used car I had bought for $800 and drove away. The relief I felt when I crossed the county line was indescribable. It was like I had been holding my breath for 20 years and finally, took a lungful of clean air. I should mention my younger sister, Fiona. She is 30 now. Fiona was the princess of the family. She wasn't subjected to the brutal expectations Donovan faced, nor the constant belittling I endured. She was just there, sheltered and spoiled. Fiona realized early on that the easiest way to survive in our house was to agree with whoever was yelling the loudest. I don't hate Fiona. I actually pity her. She married a guy from our hometown when she was just 19 years old. It was a beautiful wedding, paid for by Winston, of course. But looking back, I realized she didn't get married out of love, she got married to escape. She traded one set of walls for another. We don't talk much. Whenever she calls, she usually just parrots whatever narrative my parents and Donovan have spun about me. It's easier for her to join the bullies than to stand up for the victim. So, I was out. A 20-year-old college dropout with no degree, no family support, and a history of depression. The golden child had won the family throne, and the asthmatic scapegoat was exiled. They all expected me to crawl back a few months later, begging for a warm meal. They expected me to fail miserably. But they severely underestimated what a desperate man with nothing left to lose can achieve when he is finally left alone. My late 20s were a quiet blur of rebuilding myself from the ground up. I didn't become a millionaire overnight. Real life isn't a movie montage. Real life is eating instant noodles for dinner and counting quarters to dear laundry. I found a small apartment in a city 3 hours away and got a job working the register at a local comic book and video game store. To my family, this was the ultimate confirmation of my pathetic existence. A grown man working at a comic shop. Whenever my mother called, which was maybe twice a year, she spoke to me in that hushed, tragic tone people use when talking to a terminally ill patient. She would sigh and say she was praying for me to find a real career. I never argued. I just let them think what they wanted. But what they didn't know was that the comic shop was my sanctuary. It was my healing phase. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who didn't judge me for being quiet or nerdy. I spent my days talking about fantasy worlds and my nights teaching myself advanced coding, cybersecurity protocols, and network architecture. I was a sponge, absorbing every piece of digital knowledge I could find. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, a guy walked into the shop looking completely stressed out. He was carrying a fried computer motherboard and muttering to himself. I struck up a conversation, looked at the board, and told him exactly which capacitor had blown and how to bypass it. He looked at me like I had just performed magic. That guy became my business partner. He had the grand ambitions and the corporate connections. I had the raw technical obsession. We started hanging out in the back room of the comic shop after hours, fueled by cheap coffee and stale donuts, sketching out a business plan on the back of old comic book posters. We were going to start our own IT support and cybersecurity business. I was 29 years old, and for the first time, I had a purpose that wasn't defined by my father's anger or my brother's shadow. We launched the startup from a cramped, windowless garage that smelled permanently of damp cardboard and burnt wire. We poured every single penny we had into it. My family knew nothing about this. To them, I was still the comic book guy. The grind was brutal. I am talking about 80-hour work weeks. There were nights I didn't even bother driving back to my apartment. I would just roll out a sleeping bag under my desk, sleep for 4 hours, and wake up to the hum of servers to start coding again. We were hungry. We were building custom security architectures for small to medium businesses, finding vulnerabilities that the big corporate software companies overlooked. It was exhausting, but it was a clean kind of exhaustion. Not the soul-crushing fatigue I felt after a Sunday dinner with Donovan and Winston. This was the fatigue of a man building his own fortress. During this period, the few times I had to interact with my family were utterly surreal. I went back for Thanksgiving one year, completely sleep-deprived from a massive server migration project we had just completed. Donovan sat across the table, swirling a glass of expensive bourbon he couldn't actually afford, and lectured me for 20 minutes about the value of hard work. He told me that sitting around playing video games all day was going to rot my brain, and that I needed to understand what it meant to earn $1 in the real world. I just sat there, eating my mashed potatoes, looking at this man. I could have told him that my company just secured a contract worth more than his entire car dealership made in a month. I could have told him I managed a team of 12 engineers. But I didn't. I just nodded and said, "Yeah, Donovan. You are right. Hard work is important." Why didn't I tell them? Because I knew my family. If I told them I was successful, I wouldn't suddenly earn their respect. No, they would just view me as a resource. Winston would expect me to fund his retirement. Donovan would suddenly need a loan for a new boat. Their toxicity would just change shape, morphing from mockery into manipulation. So I kept my mouth shut, went back to my windowless office, and kept building. For years. That is how long it took us to catch the attention of the big players. A massive, multinational tech corporation noticed the proprietary security protocols I had developed and decided it was cheaper to buy us out than to compete with us. I will never forget the day the deal closed. I was 33 years old. I was sitting in my living room, refreshing my bank account app on my phone. And then, the wire transfer hit. The numbers on the screen changed. It wasn't just a lot of money. It was generational wealth. It was tens of millions of dollars in liquid cash, plus a massive portfolio of stock options. I was officially an 8-figure man. I was named the Chief Technology Officer of a new subsidiary branch. I stared at the screen until my eyes blurred. I had won the game. The asthmatic dropout had conquered the world. What is the first thing a normal person does when they get millions of dollars? They buy a sports car. They buy a mansion. They buy a Rolex to shove in the faces of everyone who ever doubted them. You know what I did? I put my phone in my pocket, walked outside, got into my squeaky, 15-year-old Saturn, and drove straight to a therapist's office. That was when I truly embraced the concept of stealth wealth. Dr. Bennett, my therapist, helped me unpack the massive amounts of financial trauma my family had inflicted on me. I realized that my family was emotionally bankrupt. They lived in a constant state of deficit, trying to fill the black hole in their souls with loud money, fake prestige, and cruelty. I didn't want to be like them. I didn't want my money to own me, and I certainly didn't want my family to know I had it. If Donovan found out about my wealth, his fragile ego would shatter, and then he would try to destroy me out of pure, unadulterated jealousy. Or worse, he would pretend to love me to get his hands on my checkbook. So, I bought a modest, comfortable 2-bedroom house in a nice, quiet neighborhood, but I furnished it with high-quality, understated pieces that didn't scream money. I kept the Saturn because it ran perfectly fine and made me invisible in traffic. I continued to dress in plain hoodies and jeans. I was a ghost. A very, very wealthy ghost. I had carved out a prosperous, incredibly peaceful life for myself in the shadows. I was safe. Or so I thought. Because the thing about toxic families is that they can't stand it when the scapegoat seems to be doing fine without them. They need you to be miserable so they can feel superior. And Donovan, drowning in his own illusions, was about to make the biggest, most catastrophic mistake of his life. Thank you so much for listening to my story. If you are enjoying it so far, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below telling me which city you are watching from. Every single comment helps push this video out to more people, and I truly appreciate your support. Stay tuned, because things are about to get crazy. The drive from my quiet, heavily wooded neighborhood to my parents' house took exactly 120 minutes. 2 hours of highway driving that always felt like a slow march toward an emotional firing squad. I still maintain the tradition of going to these Sunday dinners once or twice a month, mostly out of a misplaced sense of duty, or maybe a morbid curiosity to see how long Donovan could keep his circus act running. The transition in scenery during that drive was always symbolic of my life's journey. I would leave behind the clean, quiet streets of my hidden wealth, where the lawns were manicured and the air smelled like pine needles, and slowly enter the rusting, decaying industrial arteries of my hometown. By the time I pulled my old Saturn into Winston and Beatrice's driveway, the sky usually looked a little grayer and my stomach was tied in knots. The dynamic at the dinner table was always a scripted performance. It was a 3-hour marathon of unsolicited advice and microaggressions masked as concern. Winston would sit at the head of the table, complaining bitterly about the price of heating oil or how the local government was ruining the country. Beatrice would serve an overly dry roast beef, her eyes darting around the table as if looking for something to criticize. And then, there was Donovan. He always arrived late, ensuring he made a grand entrance that disrupted whatever conversation was happening. He would walk in wearing a polo shirt with a designer logo far too large to be tasteful, followed by Bianca, who looked like she had spent 4 hours getting ready for a simple family dinner. During one specific dinner in late October, Donovan spent nearly an hour bragging about a brand new all-terrain vehicle he had just purchased. He described the horsepower, the custom matte black finish, and the sheer amount of thousands of dollars he had dropped on it like he was giving a keynote speech. He looked at me, smirking, and asked if I even knew what a 4-stroke engine was, or if I was still busy organizing my comic book collection. But because I spent my days analyzing data and human behavior, I started noticing the massive, glaring cracks in his facade. In the very next breath after bragging about his expensive new toy, Donovan would aggressively complain about the price of a gallon of milk. He would mutter an angry story about how a waitress at a high-end steakhouse had disrespected him because his primary credit card had been declined, which he loudly blamed on a bank error. True wealth whispers, but fake wealth screams. Donovan was screaming at the top of his lungs, trying to drown out the reality of his own financial incompetence. And yet, my parents ate it up. They nodded along, praising his success, while casually throwing condescending glances my way. They would ask me if the comic shop was finally giving me a raise, or if I needed Beatrice to send me some leftover containers because I looked like I wasn't eating enough. I never corrected them anymore. I just sat there, quietly chewing my food, a multimillionaire disguised as a failure, watching a bankrupt man pretend to be a king. The turning point in my personal life came during a massive cybersecurity convention in the city. I was there anonymously, wearing my usual plain hoodie and jeans, scouting new talent for our corporate division. That was where I met Clara. She was giving a panel presentation on social engineering and human manipulation in network security. She was brilliant, sharp, and possessed a deeply grounded, no-nonsense energy that I was immediately drawn to. We grabbed coffee after her panel, which turned into a 4-hour dinner at a noisy, authentic pizza place downtown. I don't usually open up to people, but Clara had a way of disarming my defenses without even trying. I ended up telling her the truth about my life. All of it. I told her about the 8-figure buyout, my role as a chief technology officer, and the bizarre, toxic double life I lived whenever I drove back to my hometown. I expected her to be shocked, or maybe tell me I was being overly dramatic. Instead, she analyzed the situation with the precision of a professional auditor. She told me that I wasn't just dealing with a difficult family, I was dealing with a group of people who had built their entire identities around my supposed failure. She said that my silence wasn't just protecting my money, it was protecting their delusions. Over the next few months, Clara and I became inseparable. She became the mirror I needed to see myself clearly. She helped me build what we jokingly called a personal firewall. We mapped out a strategy for dealing with the Sunday dinners. Clara pointed out that my habit of staying silent and taking it was actually feeding their behavior. When I finally brought Clara to her first Sunday dinner, the atmosphere in my parents' dining room shifted dramatically. My parents were immediately suspicious of her because she was articulate and clearly didn't fit their image of a loser's girlfriend. Donovan tried his usual tactics, attempting to talk down to her by explaining a basic concept about computer viruses, assuming she was just a clueless addition to my life. Clara smiled politely, let him finish his patronizing explanation, and then casually dismantled his entire argument using advanced industry terminology that left him blinking in confused silence. She didn't do it to be mean, she did it to set a standard. For the first time in my life, I had an ally in the trenches. We started keeping our visits short and visible. We arrived on our own terms, and the moment the disrespect started, whether it was a jab about my car or a comment about my career, we would politely excuse ourselves and leave. The boundaries were slowly taking shape, but the tightening of the leash was making Donovan desperate. He could feel that he was losing his favorite punching bag, and as his own financial life began to crumble, he needed me to be the failure more than ever before. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I was sitting in my corner office, reviewing a complex piece of security architecture for a new international client. My personal phone, which sits on a dedicated encrypted dock on my desk, suddenly buzzed with a high-priority alert. It wasn't a text message or a social media notification. It was a system-level warning from the private server I keep in my home. The alert indicated that someone was running aggressive, unauthorized soft pulls on my credit history. They were digging through public records, looking for liens, lawsuits, and property taxes associated with my social security number. Now, to a normal person, this might seem like a standard case of identity theft. But in my world, identity theft is usually more subtle. This was clumsy. This was targeted. I immediately locked my office door and booted up my dedicated tracking terminal. I started pulling the access logs from the credit bureaus. Whoever was doing this was incredibly sloppy. They were using a low-tier investigative software that left digital footprints everywhere. It took me less than 15 minutes to bypass their pitiful security layers and trace the source. The trace led me directly to a small, low-budget private investigator agency operating out of a dingy strip mall 2 towns over from where my parents lived. My heart started pounding against my ribs, not out of fear, but out of a cold, hard realization. I dug deeper, accessing the agency's unencrypted client portal. I needed to see the name on the credit card that had paid for this inquiry. When the name popped up on my screen, a cold shiver went down my spine. It was Donovan. My own brother had hired a private investigator to dig into my life. The sheer weight of the betrayal hit me like a physical blow. Why? Why would he spend money he clearly didn't have to investigate his quiet, supposedly poor younger brother? I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. It was about control. It was about the narrative. With Clara in the picture and my newfound confidence in setting boundaries, Donovan felt his power slipping away. He needed ammunition. He wanted to uncover exactly how pathetic and broke I was so he could bring that evidence back to my parents. He wanted to stage a fake intervention, expose me as a financial liability, and secure his position as the ultimate, superior golden child. He wanted to publicly humiliate me to validate his own crumbling existence. He wasn't looking for the truth, he was looking for a weapon. My first instinct was pure, unadulterated rage. I wanted to drive to Donovan's house, throw him against his precious powerboat, and demand an explanation. I wanted to call the police, or sue the investigator for every privacy violation in the book. But then I remembered something Clara told me. When people try to play games with you, don't just win, change the game entirely. I knew the private investigator would eventually hit a brick wall. My real wealth, the tens of millions of dollars, was buried behind layers of anonymous trusts, shell companies, and high-level corporate non-disclosure agreements. A strip mall detective wasn't going to find my stock portfolio, but he might find a dead-end lead or an old address that Donovan could twist into something negative. I decided to take control of the narrative. The investigator was preparing to send Donovan a digital report. I slipped into their email server, which, frankly, had the security strength of a wet paper towel, and intercepted the draft email before it was sent. Then I went to work. I spent the next 3 hours crafting a masterpiece of digital fiction. I created a fake PDF report. I made it look incredibly official, complete with the investigator's agency logo, fake case numbers, and professional-looking watermarks. Inside this decoy file, I painted a picture of absolute, catastrophic failure. I stated that I had over $60,000 in high-interest credit card debt. I fabricated a notice from a non-existent landlord stating that I was 4 months behind on my rent and currently facing immediate eviction. I even added a fake employment verification note stating that I had been let go from the comic book store years ago for incompetence and currently had zero verifiable income. I even added a section about unstable mental health, referencing the depression my parents always held over my head. It was exactly what Donovan wanted to see. It was his deepest, darkest fantasy realized on paper. I attached the decoy file to the original email thread, spoofed the sender's address, and forwarded it straight to Donovan's inbox. I had set the trap, and I knew with absolute certainty that his arrogance would lead him right into it. I wanted him to feel powerful. I wanted him to feel like he had finally caught me. Because the higher he climbed on that pedestal of lies, the harder he was going to fall. Once the decoy file was safely in Donovan's hands, my anger crystallized into a cold, clinical focus. Donovan wanted to play dirty. He wanted to strip away my privacy and expose my secrets to the family. Fine. If he wanted to talk about secrets, it was time to talk about his. Using my own high-tier security clearance and a few professional background check tools that I use for corporate vetting, I ran a comprehensive audit on Donovan's life. I expected to find some debt, maybe a few maxed-out credit cards. What I found was a financial and moral catastrophe that made my jaw drop. Donovan was drowning in a sea of red ink. He had 3 separate mortgages on his house, and all of them were underwater. He had taken out massive, predatory personal loans just to keep up the appearance of his golden boy lifestyle. But that was just the beginning. I found a staggering $85,000 in unpaid back taxes owed to the Internal Revenue Service. They were already in the process of placing a lien on his property and his bank accounts. I kept digging, moving past the financials into public legal records and police logs. I found 2 prior arrests for driving while intoxicated, both of which he had managed to keep hidden from our parents by using a lawyer from out of town. And then, the most devastating discovery, multiple logged visits from Child Protective Services, triggered by anonymous domestic disturbance calls from his neighbors. His perfect home life with Bianca was a war zone of shouting matches and broken glass. My hands were actually shaking as I printed the documents. My brother was a complete fraud. His entire life, his arrogant lectures, his fancy boat, and his designer clothes, it was all built on a foundation of lies, crushing debt, and deep-seated chaos. He wasn't just financially bankrupt, he was morally and emotionally bankrupt. I gathered all the real documents, the tax liens, the arrest records, the CPS logs, and placed them neatly into a thick black folder. I locked it in my briefcase. I had the truth, and I had the proof. The trap was fully set, and the bait had been taken. All I had to do now was wait for the next Sunday dinner. Before we get to the final showdown, I want to say thank you so much for listening to my story. If you are enjoying this journey and want to see more content like this, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below telling me the name of the city you are watching from. Every single comment helps this video reach more people, and I truly appreciate your support. Now, let's get back to the night everything changed. The air inside my parents' house that Sunday evening was so thick with tension you could practically taste it. Clara sat next to me at the dining table, her posture perfect, radiating a calm, quiet strength. I could tell something was about to happen the moment we walked through the door. Donovan was practically vibrating with a kind of malicious, nervous energy. He was bouncing his leg under the table, and he wore a smug, self-satisfied grin that he couldn't quite wipe off his face. Winston and Beatrice were completely oblivious to the digital war that had been raging. Winston was busy complaining about the cost of a new lawnmower part, while Beatrice was fussing over a basket of rolls. Midway through the meal, just as we were all reaching for the salad, Donovan cleared his throat loudly. The sound was like a starter pistol. He stood up from his chair, moving with an incredibly dramatic, slow-motion flourish. He looked at my parents, putting on a mask of deep, brotherly concern that made me want to gag. He announced that he had been worried about me for a long time. He claimed that because I had been acting so secretive and unstable, he felt it was his duty as the older brother to step in. He told them he had hired a professional investigator to make sure I wasn't in any real trouble. Winston looked confused, his fork halfway to his mouth. Beatrice gasped, her hand flying to her chest. Clara just took a slow, deliberate sip of her water, her eyes never leaving Donovan's face. Donovan reached into his bag and pulled out the manila folder containing the decoy report I had fed him. He tossed it onto the center of the table. It slid across the wood, stopping right next to the gravy boat. With a voice dripping with fake pity and real venom, he began to read the fabricated statistics aloud. He told them about the $60,000 in credit card debt. He read the fake eviction notice. He told them I was unemployed and had been lying to them for years. He looked down at me, his eyes gleaming with a sick kind of triumph, and called me a pathetic parasite. He turned to my parents and told them they needed to cut me off immediately, claiming that my failures were going to drag the entire family name into the gutter. The reaction from my parents was instantaneous and visceral. Winston's face turned a dangerous shade of dark purple. He slammed his fist onto the table so hard the plates rattled. He pointed a shaking finger at me and screamed that I was a disgrace to the family. He swore right then and there that I wouldn't see a single penny of his retirement money. Beatrice started sobbing dramatically, wailing about the shame I had brought upon her and asking what she had done to deserve such a useless son. They didn't ask if I was okay. They didn't ask for my side of the story. They just attacked. And for the first time in 36 years, I didn't feel hurt. I felt free. Because I finally saw them for exactly who they were. When Winston finally ran out of breath and the room fell into a heavy, panting silence, I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I didn't beg for forgiveness. I looked at Clara and she gave me a single, affirming nod. I calmly wiped my mouth with my napkin, stood up, and picked up Donovan's fake folder. I tossed it over my shoulder like it was a piece of trash. Then I reached into my briefcase and pulled out my real documents. First, I slid my high-end, premium business card across the table directly to Winston. He squinted at it, his mouth falling open as he read the title, Chief Technology Officer. Then I dropped the real financial statements onto the table. I didn't yell. My voice was dangerously quiet and perfectly steady. I told them exactly what they were looking at. I read the numbers aloud, ensuring every zero was heard. I told them about the 8-figure bank balances. I told them about the millions of dollars in corporate stock. I showed them the deed to my home, which was fully paid for in cash. The silence in that room became so absolute you could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the next room. Winston's eyes widened to the size of saucers as he processed the sheer scale of my wealth. And then, the most nauseating part of the entire night happened. Beatrice stopped sobbing instantly. Her tears vanished, replaced by a sudden, frantic gleam of pure, unadulterated greed. She actually reached across the table, trying to touch my arm, her voice shifting into a sweet, sickeningly gentle tone. She told me she always knew I was a genius and that she had always been my biggest supporter. It made my skin crawl. Donovan was deathly pale. He started stammering, pointing at his fake folder on the floor, yelling that my documents were forged and that I was a liar. He was losing his mind because his entire reality was collapsing. That was when I dropped the second folder. The black one. I looked Donovan dead in the eye and told him that if he ever sent a bottom-feeding investigator after a cybersecurity expert again, he should expect a counterhack. I began listing his real secrets aloud, one by one. The 3 underwater mortgages. The $85,000 he owed the IRS. The secret drunk driving arrests. The visits from Child Protective Services. The room exploded. The illusion of the golden boy shattered into a million jagged pieces. Bianca let out a shriek and dropped her wine glass, which shattered on the floor. Winston grabbed Donovan by the collar, screaming about the shame of the IRS debt and the risk to the family reputation. Donovan screamed back, blaming Winston for never giving him enough to succeed. They were so busy tearing each other apart, screaming and crying and accusing each other of a lifetime of failures, that they didn't even notice when Clara and I put our coats on. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't offer a single word of closure or a promise to help with their debts. I simply opened the front door, walked out into the cool, clean night air, and left them in the burning wreckage of their own making. I realized that my family was a sinking ship, and I had finally stopped trying to plug the holes. The drive home with Clara was the quietest, most peaceful 2 hours of my entire life. The weight that had been sitting on my chest for over 3 decades was simply gone. I didn't feel a sense of triumph, and I didn't feel happy about their ruin. I just felt a profound sense of relief. In the weeks that followed, the fallout was exactly what I expected. My phone was flooded with hundreds of messages. At first, they were from my mother, filled with fake apologies and "we miss you" notes, always followed by a subtle mention of a small financial emergency Winston was having with his taxes. When I didn't respond, the messages turned nasty. Donovan sent me a series of unhinged texts, accusing me of ruining his life and calling me a traitor to the blood. I didn't block them immediately. I wanted to see their true colors one last time before I closed the door forever. I realized that my family didn't actually want me to be a failure, they just wanted me to be below them. As long as I was the loser, they felt secure. The moment I became more successful than them, I became a threat that had to be neutralized or exploited. I decided to make some permanent changes. I put a total security freeze on all my accounts and notified my legal team to prepare a formal no-contact notice if the harassment continued. I also updated my will. Since I don't have children yet, I ensured that every single penny of my estate would go to a foundation that provides medical care and support for children with severe asthma and mental health struggles, the 2 things my parents spent my childhood ignoring. Clara and I have started talking about the future. A real future. One built on honesty, respect, and actual support, not the toxic performance of traditional values. We spent one summer evening walking by a lake near our home, talking about what it means to build a family from scratch. I realized that I had finally escaped the shadow of the golden boy. I wasn't the failure middle child anymore. I was a man who had built an empire out of nothing, and more importantly, I was a man who was finally at peace. I still drive my 15-year-old Saturn sometimes, just to remind myself where I came from. But now, when people look at me in traffic and see a guy in a beat-up car, I just smile. They have no idea what is under the hood or what is in the bank. And that is exactly how I like it. I walked away from my family when they needed financial help the most, knowing my brother's fake empire was collapsing and my parents' retirement was on the line. I chose my peace over their crisis. So, tell me, am I the villain for abandoning my blood, or was I completely justified in protecting my own empire? What would you have done? Thank you so much for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that subscribe button and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more shocking real-life stories happening around you. Your support means everything to me. See you in the next one.